I remember back in the early 2000s, I was browsing the manga in my local comic book place and I came across an unusual looking manga called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I glanced at the blurb on the back and remember it saying something like, "Follow JoJo and his ancestors as they travel to Egypt to fight evil vampire Dio and his supernatural forces." JoJo's kind of a dumb name, I thought, as I placed the book back on the shelf. Which is extremely unfortunate because what I was passing up on that day was one of the most seminal, influential, and well-regarded manga series of all time. To give that overblown statement a little context, Hirohiko Ariaki's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has been in near constant publication for the last 30 years. It has sold over 95 million volumes and in 2006 was voted the second most popular manga of all time in a poll set up by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs, beating out even the likes of One Piece and Dragon Ball. More importantly, if you've enjoyed any shonen-themed manga or anime from the last 2 decades, then chances are that it has some roots in JoJo's. I'm not being facetious here. When a series has its DNA in as many different properties as Pokemon, Dragon Ball, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, Street Fighter, the Persona series, Kill la Kill, Guilty Gear, and Final Fantasy, to name but a few, you'd best sit up and take notice. What's incredible here is that despite how influential JoJo's is, there's still nothing quite like it. And while being one of Shonen Jump's longest running series, the earlier parts still hold up incredibly well, and the most recent, still going strong in Ultra Jump, are regarded with the same fan and critical regard as the previous arcs, and many would even argue that the series has only grown in strength over time, with 2005's Steel Ball Run being considered by many Ariaki's magnum opus. But how can one series sustain such a huge fan base over such a long period of time? Why is it that so many creators reference JoJo's in their work? And is it really that bizarre? Well friends, that is once again what we're here to talk about. So let's focus our breathing, activate our stands, and talk about why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Part 1. So before we get specific, here's a little overview of how JoJo's works as a concept. Currently, JoJo has been running since 1987 and in that time has been broken into 8 major parts. Each part features a brand new protagonist and a completely different setting. The events that occur in each part are mostly self-contained but occasionally share 1 or 2 cast members. The binding thread here is the Joestar bloodline, to which each respective protagonist is a part of, starting out with Jonathan Joestar in 1880 and coming right up to the modern day, with 1 or 2 universe-shattering plot incidents thrown in for good measure. And all 8 have a star-shaped birthmark on their left trapezius. All 8 seem predestined to assemble a motley crew and do battle with some dark or nefarious force. The cool thing here is that out of all 8 protagonists, they all stand out as unique and distinct characters, and while I certainly have my favourites among the bunch, I genuinely enjoy each and every one of them for their own distinct reasons. Some, like Part 2's Joseph Joestar, are fiery and charismatic, while others, like Part 5's Giorno Giovanni, are placid and calculating. The difference between them highlight Ariaki's extreme willingness to take risks, and I can't think of a single other writer in fiction who has both written and discarded so many iconic, likeable and hilarious heroes. And I think Ariaki's willingness to move on from a character once their story's been told accounts both for JoJo's inexhaustible staying power as well as Ariaki's vastly improved character writing over the years. Watching him develop as both a writer and an artist is one of the joys of experiencing JoJo's, but more on that later. Now with all that in mind, we need to start somewhere, and no better place than the original JoJo, Jonathan Joestar, in part 1 of the entire series, the arc known as Phantom Blood. The 2012 anime adaptation of Phantom Blood was my first real exposure to JoJo's, and from the moment that Dio turned and glared at the camera, I could feel that this was something I was probably going to enjoy. Set in 1880 Victorian England, it tells the story of 2 adoptive brothers, righteous upstanding young gentleman Jonathan Joestar, and sociopath and all-around bad dude Dio Brando. The supernatural showdown that takes place between these 2 adoptive brothers is at the heart of Phantom Blood, and so what say we dive right in. Normally it's at this point in a Why You Should Watch that I'd start to break apart why the protagonist works, but for reasons that I'll get into later, I'd like to go and instead examine our main antagonist, Dio Brando. To me, the real strength of Phantom Blood is the duality of its two central characters. This is a story about two people, and in a lot of ways I think it's nearly more about Dio than it is about Jonathan. We're only a few minutes into episode 1 that it becomes apparent that Dio is about as big a shitheel as they come. But what separates Dio from other irredeemable villains, and trust me guys, Dio is fucking irredeemable, is that the show goes to great lengths to establish why Dio acts the way he does, long before he ever reaches the status of a true villain. Each of Dio's scenes in the first 3 episodes tell us something new and important about the character, and often in a way that's subtler than you might expect. Take a look at this scene from episode 1. A young Dio defeats his opponent in chess, only to then have his head violently slammed into the table. This scene, while taking barely any screen time, lets us know 4 important things about Dio. 1. The setting itself. This scene takes place in a grimy pub. The fact that Dio is frequenting a place like this means it's probably fair to assume that both him and his family are not members of society's elite. 2. Despite his young age, he's intelligent enough to defeat a more experienced older player with what seems like some degree of ease. 3. Getting his head slammed shows that this is obviously not a situation he chooses to be in willingly. Life's not easy for young Dio, and despite his intelligence, he does not have the power to change his social position. His lack of fear or surprise shows us perhaps that this isn't the first time something like this has happened to him. Number 4, and this one is probably the subtlest but also the most important. As the man mocks Dio, Dio reaches for the fork sitting next to him, most likely with the intent of stabbing his attacker, but then after a moment's consideration, chooses not to. What I love here is it's not fear stopping Dio from taking action, we can tell that from his facial expression. Rather, he's frustrated. The choice not to pick up the fork seems to be a tactical one. Like in a brief moment he's run the numbers and knows that he can't come out on a physical altercation with this attacker. Dio's ability to look at a situation and calculate his place within it later becomes an important part of why he's so dangerous, and seeing it seeded so early on in the story gives his later actions all the more gravity. Jonathan, on the other hand, is everything Dio isn't. He's an exuberant young man with old-fashioned ideas about chivalry and helping those in need. Only problem is that he does not have the physicality to back it up. While he's certainly not an overly complicated character, his innocence and enthusiasm are endearing. He doesn't seem like the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's a nice guy who wants nothing more than to get into boyish adventures with his dog and best friend Danny. So, just to note here, this has all been established about 7 minutes into the first episode. Already we have 2 well-defined characters, both of whom have grander things they wish to aspire to. These characters are now perfectly positioned to crash into each other, which, holy hell, is exactly what happens when Dio is adopted by the Joestar family, and from the moment Dio steps off the carriage, shit kicks off. Dio sees Jonathan as everything he isn't and never had the chance to be. To Dio, Jonathan is a spoiled weakling who deserves nothing of his family's fortune or any respect. Dio begins to inflict the exact kind of cruelty and punishment we've seen him endure earlier in the episode. He systematically goes through each separate part of Jonathan's life and inflicts as much damage as possible, isolating him from his peers, coming between him and his father, and even attempting to steal his romantic interest in Erina. Before long, it becomes obvious that Dio is more manipulative and just plain evil than we ever originally gave him credit for, but in turn we also start to see a different side of Jonathan. In the beginning, Jonathan can't even comprehend why Dio is doing this to him. All he wanted was for the 2 of them to be friends, and it's not long before it seems like Jonathan is hopelessly outmatched against Dio. But despite everything Dio puts Jonathan through, Jonathan endures it all and ends up becoming stronger because of it. And when he does actually stand up to Dio at the end of episode 1, we feel elated. There's a real schoolyard feeling of the weakling finally kicking the bully's ass, and we're proud of Jonathan. This ends episode 1 as we timeskip 7 years forward, and hey, Jonathan and Dio are best friends now, except they're totally not. So, this is all before JoJo's ever really lives up to its namesake, before things ever really get truly bizarre. But I feel it's important to point out just how strong a setup Phantom Blood is. By the end of the first episode, we already have strong and complicated feelings about our 2 central characters. Dio's an asshole, obviously, but at the same time, we know what made him that way. And that understanding brings a level of complexity to his character often missing from villains. Meanwhile, we've watched Jonathan become stronger through his adversity with Dio, and because of this, we're already rooting for him. This is all before any of the supernatural lunacy kicks in, long before Dio becomes an unkillable psychotic vampire cult leader, and an Italian man in a top hat teaches Jonathan magical sunshine karate. But that's kind of awesome too. We already know how we feel about these characters, and that setup isn't complicated by trying to understand the rules of the supernatural situation they're both going to become a part of. When Dio becomes a vampire in episode 3, it's terrifying, because we already know what a monster he is as an ordinary human. On the flip side, it's fun watching Jonathan master his Hamon battle style, as he's already overcome so much with conviction alone. Jonathan and Dio work as a rivalry because they're essentially two characters who constantly change the path the other one is on. Dio's initial attempts to ruin Jonathan's life in pursuit of his own goals creates a stronger Jonathan, who in turn forces Dio's malice to new levels, which ends up leading Dio down a much darker path than if the two had never met in the first place. It's this kind of cause and effect dynamic that makes a fictional relationship believable, and watching their relationship shift and change over the course of Phantom Blood is one of the best things about it. If that last line about vampire psychopaths and magical sunshine magicians caught you off guard, then hoo boy, you have a lot coming your way, my friends. Lest I remind you that this is called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and Ariaki was not fucking around when he picked that name. JoJo's is seriously weird, even long before everyone starts fighting with psychic punching ghosts. However, this also highlights a major strength of the series and Ariaki himself. It's outlandish and wild on a level few other animes can even touch. Characters all express themselves with hyper-dramatic cries of dialogue, and they strike insane fashion model style poses. And some of the logic behind the action scenes are so insane that you can't help but laugh, while the characters themselves take the situation deathly seriously. This is crazy stuff, and to further illustrate this point, here's a few completely out of context moments. Jack the Ripper leaps out of an exploding horse in order to attack Jonathan. A disembodied head and a full-grown man have a wrestling match, and previously mentioned Sunshine Magician punches a tiny frog in order to prove a point. But it's all pulled off with a bravado that both acknowledges its own insanity while never really compromising the believability of its characters or plot. This stuff is so ludicrous that it constantly borders on parody, but what I think keeps it grounded is that even while the characters face these insane encounters, the motives and dynamic of Jonathan and Dio is the driving force behind it all. And this gives us something of substance to cling to throughout the near constant lunacy. This technique of having a relatively simple and grounded core plot accented by insane subplots is something Ariaki would later become a master of, but even as it is here, it's pulled off pretty effectively. I think credit is due here to David Production. Phantom Blood doesn't seem like a show with an excessive budget or time frame, but stylistically it completely works, and its outlandish visuals and boarding match the tone of the story perfectly. They use an interesting technique where they'll completely switch up the colour palette of a scene, just to add a jolt of surrealism to it, and it gives the whole show an offbeat and energetic feel. Dramatic camera moves are used equally well, and do a lot to up the already over-the-top emotions of the characters, even when the animation tends to be quite sparse. While not being the most amazing show you'll ever see, I have to give it up for David Productions on this one. They worked really effectively from a source material that I imagine was probably not so easy to work from. The voice acting for the most part is pretty great, with special mention to Takehito Koyasu's rendition of Dio, handling the role with all the seething bravado that one of anime's most iconic villain deserves. And you know what? Dub's totally fine too. Yes, I found it super jarring at first, but the voice actors sound like they're having a lot of fun with the performances, and after listening for a couple of episodes, so was I. Now, with all that in mind, as much as I enjoy Phantom Blood, you'd be delusional to think it's a perfect show. Essentially, you can break Phantom Blood down into 3 major arcs, all of which revolve around the conflict between Jonathan and Dio. But for me, the real strength in Phantom Blood lies in Arc 1, which covers episodes 1 to 3, and the final arc, which is just a single episode. This leaves the middle and weakest arc with the most episodes. And don't get me wrong, there's still some good stuff here, but it's really where you can see Ariaki struggling to find his voice with JoJo's. In fact, it kind of feels a little like Fist of the North Star written by a crazy person. We spend way too long watching a battle with these relatively uninteresting zombie knights, and new characters are introduced and disposed of before we ever really get a chance to know them. Jonathan just battles his way through some minor villains before encountering Dio once again, and honestly it just feels a little standard, and if there's one thing you could never accuse the rest of JoJo's of, it's of being standard. The logic of the fight is a little underdeveloped. Jonathan wins a lot of his battles through simply being A, super tough, or B, super righteous, which is generally how fights went during the period in manga when Phantom Blood was published. This is actually something we're going to come back to in a later video, because it's something Ariake would heavily rectify in JoJo's Part 2, and that knock-on effect would reverberate through the entire anime and manga industry. But at this point, Ariake is definitely still figuring it out. While there are some fun characters here, I think it's also fair to say that Jonathan and Dio are the only ones who really stand by themselves. The rest of the cast are really just supports to them in various ways, which is okay, it just makes the world of Phantom Blood feel a little small. If it sounds like I have more problems with Phantom Blood than I would usually in a Why You Should Watch, then that's actually because I do. Phantom Blood has issues, like no doubt. But it's when you start to look at it as a small part of a larger whole does it become something truly special. A lot of this for me comes from viewing it as an artifact of sorts, as not only something very much of its time but also a brilliant snapshot of it, the first major creative success of one of manga's most talented and prolific creators. If there's one thing that's critical for me if I'm going to become a long-term fan of an artist, it's that I need to see their desire to change and grow, no matter how high their base level talent is. Take the art of Blackie Junk Gallery for example. I became a fan of theirs a couple of years ago, and despite absolutely loving their initial work, each year I'm surprised and impressed with the new directions they take it, and how willingly they are to discard old staples and styles for the sake of trying something new. It's one thing to find an artist you like, but something else entirely when you come to respect them for their drive to improve. This, in a nutshell, is why I have so much respect for Ariake. Over the years, he's reworked and defined practically every part of himself as a manga creator, and watching him improve so dramatically as an artist and as a writer is just about one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had as a consumer of media. It's in this light that Phantom Blood becomes important, because it's the start of Ariake's journey, and in it you can see all the disparate elements that Ariake is struggling to galvanize. He wants to draw the Adonic, hulking, Schwarzenegger-type ubermen of 80s pop culture, but he also wants to adorn them with lavish, high-fashion inspired outfits and have them strike flamboyant and often effeminate poses. He wants each combat encounter to be a touching and emotional battle, while at the same time being something completely off the wall and ludicrous. He wants to fill the world with unique and colourful characters, but it's only really Jonathan and Dio that stand on their own. Even looking back at his previously publicised works, Bao and Cool Shock BT, there's a surprising lack of consistency between works, which is a good indication that when Ariake wrote Phantom Blood, he was still very much finding his voice as an artist. Even in Jonathan himself, he's a surprisingly passive and reactionary character, nearly unsure of himself, which I think mirrors Ariake's artistic position at the time. Ariake even spoke about this in the interview of Volume 1 of JoJonium. Referring to Jonathan's character, he writes, "He was maybe a little on the boring side. Jonathan's passive, reacting to Dio's various attacks, and this leads him to discover his own way of life. Perhaps this linked him to me as an author. Just as Jonathan was unsure how to live his life, I was unsure what way to take the character. Maybe I grew as an author a little with Jonathan as he trudged up through life's hardships." Now, don't misunderstand me here. None of this is to say that Phantom Blood isn't worth watching, far from it in fact. On its own merits, Phantom Blood is a fun as hell show with some real heart, but it's as part 1 of JoJo's bizarre adventure that it becomes something truly important to experience. All the conflicting elements I've mentioned here are problems that Ariake would eventually not only solve but completely master. These are the elements that would come to define his later work, and infuse JoJo's with an energy and longevity that's maybe only seen once or twice a generation. Now, before we finish up here, there's one more point I'd like to cover in Phantom Blood, and to do so I'm going to have to go into detail about major plot events up to and beyond the final episode. So if you've got everything you need to know about Phantom Blood, then now would be a good point to bow out, and I'll catch you next time. Okay, we good? Alright. I mentioned earlier in this video how I feel that Jonathan was not an overly complicated character, and while that's certainly true, I do feel the final episode adds to him some critical nuance and tragedy. Unbeknownst to Jonathan and his new bride Erina, the same ship that's ferrying them to their honeymoon has also been boarded by Dio's disembodied head and zombie minions, who seek to inflict a final and brutal revenge against Jonathan. This conflict ends with Jonathan clutching Dio's head, as he knows to put a final end to Dio, he must sacrifice himself. That's pretty tragic by itself, but where this becomes a real heartbreaker is despite everything Dio has put Jonathan through, all the manipulation, the attempts on his life, the killing of his father, Jonathan still can't bring himself to hate Dio. Some part of Jonathan still views him as a brother, and he embraces Dio in the final moments of his life, content that the fighting is over and at the very least they can coexist at least this one time. It's a beautiful scene, and a fitting end to a magnificent rivalry and deeply complicated relationship, only becoming more tragic by the events we find out about in Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. But friends, that is a video for another day. This draws Phantom Blood to a close, but of course we're nowhere near done with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. In fact, we've barely scratched the surface in why JoJo's becomes the worldwide smash hit it has. So join me in Part 2, where I'll be discussing, Part 2, Battle Tendency, one of my absolute favourite arcs in all of JoJo's. Friends, thank you again for joining me today. There's been a lot of requests for different videos, and so I'm still figuring out the exact release schedule, but suffice to say there's some stuff coming up I'm pretty excited about. We will definitely be returning to JoJo's as well as a host of other animes in future videos, but for now friends, a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed, commented or liked, and I'll see you guys next time.